Time now for What the Farage. And an Afghan migrant who was deported from the UK 4 years ago after raping a 12-year-old girl has been found on the French coast trying to return to the country. Discovered by the Times newspaper, Emil Kochai has served half of his 9-year jail sentence before being sent back to Afghanistan in 2019. But the rapist scum is now launching an illegal comeback, saying he will never give up. His bid has been slammed by his British foster mother, who warned him there is nothing here for you and to not come back to right. But Nigel Farage, does this show the clear danger of the left's open border policy, which would allow people like Kochai very easily back into the country?
Well, of course, because he can come back into the country. He won't have a passport or any identity document on him at all. He'll give the British authorities a false name. He will more than likely come in undetected, be put into a 4-star hotel and then move on from there. I mean, that is danger, Dan, at a personal level, and it's distressing and it's wrong, should never be allowed to happen. But just think about this. A lot of people that have come in the last 3 years say they've come from Syria. Again, with no identity documents. Who's to say they weren't ISIS fighters just a few short years ago? And remember, when this all started in 2015, when the EU opened up their own asylum policy, which said, if you put 1 foot on EU soil by crossing the Med, you can stay. And that's why in the Brexit campaign, I used that poster of hordes of young men coming into Europe saying we've got to protect ourselves from this. When that happened, ISIS said they would use the route to flood Europe with their operatives. And here's a point everyone's forgotten. Of the 8 men that committed those almost unspeakable barbarities in Paris that night a few years ago, 5 of them had come across the Mediterranean in boats. So, yes, this does pose a threat to us at absolutely every level. And yet, when you stand up and say that, you are called all the names under the sun by the establishment media, existing politicians. I mean, how interesting, even George Osborne, the former Chancellor this week, distancing himself from the language that's being used by Suella Braverman and indeed even by Rishi Sunak. So we have this sort of inbuilt guilt complex as a country. We have to be nice to everybody. And the truth is, when it comes to allowing people into the country, either legally or giving people asylum, namely refugee status, and this word will really shock people, we have to discriminate. We have to make decisions about who we do and do not want to come into the country. And, even the use of that word now, the Labour Party say Suella and Rishi are wrong in what they're proposing. We must have open, clear routes for people to come. Well, how many? I mean, even the UNHCR say there are up to 100 million people who potentially could come to Britain. And just think about this. One of the ways you can claim asylum in Britain is to say you're gay and you're being discriminated against. 121 countries in the world have some form of anti-homosexual law in operation. If you add to that extreme poverty, basically most of the world, according to the Labour Party, can come into the UK. So look, I'm pleased, and Suella Braverman, rather like Priti Patel before her, seems genuine and sincere in her wish to stop this.
Yeah.
And she herself, coming from legal immigrant family, understands how important fairness is. But can this be done if we don't crack the nut of the European Court of Human Rights? And it isn't just their judges that are the problem. And the one aspect of this that no one's talked about over the last week is the British judiciary. And the British judiciary, it appeared to me, to be pretty much on a par with the Foreign Office and the leader writers at The Guardian. And so I think the legal problems will not just come from Europe, I think they'll come in this country too. And ultimately, what this legislation does, and don't forget, we were told last year that the Nationality and Borders Act would deal with this. All this legislation does, effectively, is to kick the can down the road. there is going to be at some point a gigantic decision that the Conservative Party has to face. And it's almost identical to the Brexit question. When Brexit came, as a party, they, of course, opposed us leaving. At the moment, the Conservative Party oppose us leaving the ECHR.
Yeah, they do.
But I want to leave, Dan. You want to leave.
Yeah.
A growing number of the silent majority want to leave. And I don't think that Brexit actually gets completed until we genuinely...
We're out of the ECHR. I know, and there's the Tory backbenchers as well who are wanting to add this amendment to the bill. So I think it's the next big fight. But look, Nigel, I wanted to quickly talk stateside, because really significant moment from your mate, Donald Trump, who was in Iowa last night, just 72 hours, of course, after his rival Ron DeSantis made his own visit. And Trump made a very big claim about his ability to stop World War III. Look at this.
Standing before you today, I am the only candidate who can make this promise. I will prevent World War III, because I really believe you're going to have World War III.
Nigel, strong words, but actually, look at his time in office compared to Biden's time in office. Does he have a fair point?
You know, it's very interesting. He was always worried about Ukraine. A year before the invasion, I went to see him at Mar-a-Lago. He said, I fear Putin could go into Ukraine. I said, no, it'll be fine. Well, tell you what, I was wrong, and he was absolutely right. The invasion would never have happened with Trump in the White House. Of that, I'm absolutely certain, because he told me personally that he'd spoken to Putin and said, you do this, and I'll knock out much of your lovely architecture in Moscow. Now, I believe every word of that. But he believes in peace through strength. And he sees himself as a negotiator. And let's just remember this. This was the guy whose administration brokered the Abraham Accords, the historic accords between Israel and a number of Arab states, something, by the way, that China is now trying to undermine by getting Iran and Saudi Arabia in the same room last week. He's the president that didn't launch any fresh wars. He's the only president in recent times under whom the Russians didn't make an incursion. So he sees himself as a peace broker. He's not the neocon that we had with both Democrats and Republicans over the last few years, and he genuinely wants peace. And I think this could be a very important card for him to play, not just in the American elections, but actually on the world stage too.